Sandra, your webinar host. Welcome to our wellness webinar. Our topic is self-care and compassion fatigue, things many of us have become more familiar with on this pandemic journey. Carlie Pagens has graciously partnered with Eastside Church of God to facilitate today's learning session. Carlie is an assistant professor, counseling and internship coordinator at Briarcrest Seminary in Caronport, Saskatchewan. She also works in private practice as a therapist. Carlie has over 10 years experience in healthcare and education environments, which has provided her with the experience working with people struggling with mental health issues and/or addictions, working with youth, adults, and families. And today's session, Carlie has invited myself and Glenda Wall to join her. Our desire for this session is to acknowledge our community's hands-on frontline workers, people who have consistently risen to the challenge and uncertainty of this extended pandemic journey with commitment and perseverance. We see you, healthcare workers, educators, emergency responders, and support staff. It's our hope that Carlie's passion for mental and spiritual wellness will bring both learning and encouragement in this session. Thank you for tuning in. I encourage you to share this webinar link with family, friends, and on your social media platforms.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Self-care and compassion fatigue matters deeply to me. So you've heard a little bit about who I am in my current role, a bit about my history, but spending 10 years in healthcare, working with mental health and addictions and a stint in management, and also a stint working in a COVID testing site. Compassion fatigue and the need for self-care is something I'm very familiar with. I guess when I was approached about this webinar, something that came to mind and a story I shared with Sandra and with Kevin was really the story that kicked off a season of burnout for me. I was working as a counselor in mental health and addictions in Moose Jaw, working primarily with high-risk youth, and I experienced the death of someone that I worked with, and it was really difficult. I'd say it was actually traumatic for me. It wasn't the first time that someone I had worked with had passed away by suicide, but I found myself in that season particularly struggling, and in that season, so previously in similar situations, I was hesitant to reach out for help. And in this season, I knew I was struggling, and really for one of the first times I reached out and needed help, and found I didn't actually have the support I needed. And for me, there was a cue that something needed to change. I knew I wasn't in a great spot, and knew that I was heading in a direction that was unhealthy for me. So I took a leave of absence. I actually was able to switch positions, and I came out to Briarcrest and did 5 months directing their counseling center for a change. And when they asked me to come back, I was happy to return, but I actually only made it about a year, and really found that healthcare was a setting where I struggled to be healthy. And so, Sandra said, we see you, and we do, and I feel along with you. I know that it can be such a tough place to work, and the impact on your mental health is significant. And so, I'm not sure that anything I share today is going to be new. Things we've heard, but perhaps the conversation and the way we go about it today can encourage us all to prioritize, boundaries and self-care, and learn about the early learning signs in compassion fatigue, and figure out how do we intervene early to be healthier people. So it matters to me because it's impacted my life. It also, many of my friends continue to work in healthcare and education settings, paramedics and doctors and nurses and therapists, and I've watched them be deeply impacted by compassion fatigue. I've watched many have to walk away from their jobs, and those who've stayed, who've continued to struggle and not found ways to cope, often talk about feeling different and not like themselves in the season. And so it's impacted me, it's impacted friends and family. And so, it matters deeply to me. So I'm gonna share a quote with you. Like probably many of us watching this, I've sat through many, probably too many self-care training and webinar, and found some of them pretty unhelpful. But I remember sitting in one that I found particularly helpful. And this quote came up, and it's nothing new. We've all heard it. We can't help others if we aren't well ourselves. And yet it stuck out to me, and I remembered this quote. Was able to return back to that webinar a few times, and just understanding that we all know self-care is important, and it's one more thing sometimes we need to do, but I know even when I don't want to care for myself, or I don't feel like I have it in me to care for myself, I know that I do want to care well for others. And so when I don't have the motivation to care for myself, simply because I value my own health, I do know that, my care for others is a reason that I do need to prioritize my own self-care. And so that's really stood out to me. I don't know, Sandra and Glenda, if you have anything to add to that.
I think that really hits the nail on the head. Is these frontline caregiving kinds of professions are people who are hardwired to give and to care deeply, and that's what makes the self-care journey so difficult. Yeah. It can sometimes become very easy to be unbounded and pour until you're parched and struggle tremendously. Yeah. And that's when things like bitterness and resentment can crop up, and that's not going to serve anybody well. These people that are going home to loved ones they're going to get the leftovers, if there's even any leftover to offer. And so it's important to remember that, to prioritize self, for sure.
Yeah. And that finding balance, like Sandra, like you said, I think is so important. Balance in family, balance to work, and then also, for sure, first is balance to yourself. Mm-hmm. And just making sure that you don't let yourself go. Yeah. That it matters to look after yourself, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So we'll chat a little bit more about that through our time. I'm going to start with just some warning signs. And this is both what we might feel if we're starting to be impacted by compassion fatigue. And I also want to touch on what we might see in others, because we all have loved ones who work in the caring profession. And so how can we become aware of what we might see if they're struggling? So what we might experience are increased anxiety or feelings of hopelessness. We might not enjoy the things that we once enjoyed. We just don't find joy in those things anymore. Another one that for me, I definitely experience is feeling irritable or on edge. And we all have moments of that. You have a nagging 4-year-old, and sometimes we just feel irritated. But if we're finding that more than usual, or a lot of the time we're on edge or irritable, it's a pretty good warning sign that something might be off. Self-doubt, again, we're all gonna have times where we're not sure of what we've done, if it's, but if I'm constantly checking or unsure if I've done the right thing, and that's not my norm, that's a pretty clear red flag for us. A lack of empathy, that's one that often comes a little bit later on when we're struggling with compassion fatigue, and knowing that those who working in the field often are very empathetic. This is very out of the norm for us to be at the place where we are struggling to have empathy for others, and difficulty concentrating. So those are some of the things. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the things we might experience later on, but that's kind of an introduction to what we might feel. And then for those who have people who we love who work in the field, some things to just watch out for is isolation. Now, some of us are introverts and we just like alone time. But again, we're looking for a change in baseline behavior here. We might start to hear complaints about not sleeping well or lack of appetite because of the physical ways that we are experiencing the stress, which again, we'll talk a bit more about. Withdrawing from activities, or the opposite of really increasing activities. So someone who, might have worked out here and there, suddenly running every day and just doing things all the time, likely to distract, again, as a warning sign that something is different or off. And any sudden changes in mood or behavior. So these are some things, again, I can look at this list and pick one or two out that for me fit. Sandra and Glenda, I'm sure that you have a few on this list that you would say, oh yeah, that's how it impacts me. We're all a little bit different. And those are only some of many. We will dig in a bit more to what that might look like as we go along. So, so most of us have heard the concept of, so take a glass of water, of a cup being full and pouring out, right? And if our cup is empty, we have nothing to pour. And so that's a really common imagery that we use when we talk about self-care and burnout and compassion fatigue. A colleague of mine, Margaret Clark, introduced me to this image a few years ago. And this has been one that's really stuck with me. I've appreciated it, looking at it a little bit differently. Instead of as one cup, and look at it as 4 different tanks. And this is built off the biopsychosocial spiritual model. And we know that we're whole people and we're impacted in all 4 areas. Spiritual doesn't necessarily mean religious, right? And so for me, I'm part of a Christian faith, but for those who aren't, there's still a spiritual aspect to who we are as humans. And so we'll talk about these tanks. We know that burnout and compassion fatigue don't show up overnight. I'm not doing well today and my tanks are full, and tomorrow I wake up and I'm like, oh, I'm burnt out, right? There is this gradual process that we experience. And what we want to do is pay attention to like a gas gauge in a car, how we're doing, and are these gauges starting to go down and down and down? They're not going to just go down at once. And so each of these are important ones to pay attention to. And hopefully by starting to do that, we catch it a bit earlier. We catch that we're not doing well, and we can intervene and make some changes in our life before we are in a place of burnout or significant compassion fatigue. So we want to ask ourselves, am I running empty in one of these areas? Is there one that I need to intentionally change and prioritize? Which one or which some needs some extra care in my life right now? So some cues that we might be low in an area. So physically, we might not be sleeping or eating well. We might not be eating low appetite. We might be coping by overeating or having some unhealthy habits. For me, something that I notice actually when I'm struggling in this realm is I'm sore all the time. I'm carrying the tension in like my back and my neck, and I get headaches. And so that for me is a sign that something's off. Socially, I might be withdrawing from people. I'm a pretty social person. And so not wanting to go and play board games with friends and those things. Now, COVID has made this a difficult one to gauge because we're not allowed to, we shouldn't be doing some of these things. But even a lack of interest in texting with friends that I love and those things, just paying attention to, how am I engaging with people? So, emotionally, just paying attention to those cues that something might be off. It's healthy and normal to experience a wide range of emotions, but if I'm constantly, feeling down or anxious and it's changed, again, paying attention to that's an area of my life I probably need to look at. And then spiritually, paying attention to, am I wanting to engage in things that I, find typically spiritually meaningful, or am I struggling to engage in that way? So, Sandra and Glenda, any thoughts about kind of this idea of seeing it as 4 tanks and paying attention to each of them?
I quite like the idea. The idea of the cup, pouring from a cup and it just being a single vessel, didn't ever really factor in the various parts. And I really like this graphic. I think it's wise for sure.
Yeah, I really like the idea of looking at all of the areas and the person as a whole. And that knowing that if one area is doing really well and one area is not doing well at all, you can still recognize it.
Yeah.
I kind of look at it sometimes as, and I've seen this similar, but looked at it as the 4 tires on a car.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a great
one is going flat. They're all going flat.
Yeah.
You're going to be off the road in the ditch pretty quickly. Yes, for sure.
Yeah. And with the cup metaphor, although it's a great metaphor, it works well. It's an image that works.
Yes.
It also leaves us not knowing what to do with it. Okay, so my cup is empty. Now what?
Yeah. Now what?
If I can pay attention to all 4 of these, I can maybe target the area. Like I actually might be doing really well in some of these, and there's just one that's off. And so I can really target that and go, okay, I feel a sense of I know what to do. In a time that feels a bit uncontrollable, I can come up with a bit of a strategy. And I know for me that really helps.
I think it also allows you or encourages you to be really self-aware.
Absolutely.
So recognizing what's good and typical for you in each of those areas, you're more apt to notice when things are a bit off or a bit haywire, or the people around you might. If you are self-aware, you tend to model that specifically in those areas, and I think it would show for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to talk a bit about each of these 4 separately. I've talked a bit about the cues of, when something might be low. Something I always want to do is offer some strategies, and they're not necessarily my own, some are mine. But what are some strategies in each of these sections that might be helpful to try? I know that when we're struggling, often it's hard to come up with ideas. And so I think it's important to share ideas. So I'll share a few, and then Sandra and Glenda, if you've got any to add as well. Something that we don't realize is that when we're not doing well, we actually tend to hold our breath. We don't breathe well. Especially, if I'm at the office and a crisis has come up, if I were to check myself, I think my breathing rate would not be at a healthy rate. And so just stop it and take a deep breath. For me, it's all I do is take some, 3 or 4 deep breaths. There are some great breathing activities out there that you can Google and find that people find particularly helpful. There's one called 4-square breathing that some like. There's a variety of breathing techniques we can try, but just finding one that works for you, and to stop and taking a deep breath. It's amazing the ways in which it settles ourselves just enough to get through the moment, and allows us to just think clearer. So take a walk or some physical exercise. Oftentimes, myself included, when we're stressed, we might do something like a vigorous workout, like going for a run. And that at times can be helpful. But when our system is stressed, it actually sometimes can be less than helpful. And so a gentle activity like yoga or stretching, a light walk, are things that can help our system settle a little bit. Prioritizing sleeping and eating. Again, sometimes when we're struggling, we might want to watch Netflix for 10 hours just to escape life. And then we don't get enough sleep. And so finding ways to at least make an effort. I know sometimes if we're stressed, it's hard to sleep and eat, but just trying to find a rhythm that creates space for sleeping and eating, and being healthy about how we do that. Progressive muscle relaxation is another favorite of mine. It's a way that we actually tense and then relax parts of our body, and it releases the physical tension we experience. And a quick Google will give you hundreds of really great guided ones where a calming, soothing voice will walk you through how to do that. It's something that people find particularly helpful at night if they can't sleep and they're holding tension in their body. It's a great physical strategy. Take a break. Physically leave the environment. Now, lots of us in helping professions like teachers and paramedics and nurses, it's hard to get a break. But when you get the opportunity, the importance to take it. And so something that I started doing at the end of my time in healthcare is, when I could get 10 minutes, I would just go outside when it's not maybe minus 30 like today. I would go outside and just do a walk once around the block. And that alone and physically leaving the space were great to just help settle myself. What about you guys, Sandra and Glenda? What are some things that help, physically calm both of you?
Physical exercise for sure. To be able to do something where there's some movement and just a change of scenery. Sometimes I find just, if you're inside the house, get outside the house. If you're at work, leave the workspace. Like you said, go for a walk around. Even I used to work in a building that had 5 floors. And working on the top floor, that I just would take the steps down and take steps back up. And it didn't take very long, but sometimes just that little bit of change of pace was all it took to regain some focus. And
I really find the deep breathing. And if you're finding that you're not even sure how you're breathing, is to do it with somebody else. And just that breathe in and breathe out. And it's a conscious effort to do that. Takes your mind off of whatever else is going on because you're concentrating on your breathing. And then for me, it's kind of just close your eyes and concentrate on those breaths and trying to block out everything else for sure.
I love that, Glenda, that idea of with someone else. It's something I don't actually talk about. I'm surprised I don't somewhere in here. This idea we call co-regulation. When someone's having a hard time regulating themselves, having someone regulate beside them actually has a physical impact on us. And so having someone who can breathe with us helps regulate our own systems. And so that's a hugely beneficial thing.
I used to do that with my daughter when she was small, but I didn't realize it had a name.
That's actually what teaches kids how to regulate themselves.
Yes.
We learn by
yes, absolutely. Yeah. I could see that, and I knew it needed to be intentional. I just, and so wherever we were, I would just park on the floor beside her and do that. And I certainly got some looks, but
and it's funny, we think about that with kids all the time, and yet when as adults, as helping professionals, there are times where traumatic things happen and we are dysregulated. I remember a time where something had happened and I was on a locked unit and there was some violence and it was really scary. And I was, like pretty like activated. And I had a colleague just come alongside and speak slowly and gently. And then she breathed with me and she invited me to take a breath. And I hadn't thought about that until you said that, Glenda. But it suddenly just settled me. And that importance of co-regulation. So yeah, let's talk emotionally. We can tune into our emotions. It's something we don't do actually. It's infrequent that until it's like in our faces, we don't often say, hey, what is it that I'm feeling? And what might that be telling us? We do a great job at ignoring our emotions. And I wonder what it might be like to just spend a bit more time tuning into how we feel, allowing ourselves to feel the grief or despair or fear. Maybe it's nagging and maybe it's raging, maybe it's in our face or maybe it's a bit more below the surface, but just paying attention to it and wondering what might that be telling us, right? I think our emotions are sending a signal to tell us something. And so tuning into that before they get so loud that we can't ignore it, can be a really helpful thing and a practice that, it's really beneficial. Talk to someone you trust. I mean, that goes along with the social piece, but find someone you trust. I know we'll talk about this a bit later too. Sometimes we maybe can't talk to someone at home because of the content of what we experience at work. But I know in difficult times, my colleagues have been some of the best people to be able to talk to about some of the stressors that we encounter, related to compassion fatigue. Journaling. I despise journaling, but lots of people love it. And so I always include it on the list, even though it's my least favorite thing. You tend to love it or hate it. Those who like to journal find it really helpful. Oftentimes when, again, we're facing compassion fatigue, we start to forget to do those things that we used to do that were helpful. And so if you used to journal and now you're not and you're struggling, it might be a good time to pull that journal back out. So ask for help with emotionally draining tasks. Now, there's some things that only we can do in our job. And sometimes we have things that are draining for us that others can help with, and we can share the load. And so asking for help when we can, and take that opportunity. Meet with a therapist or a support group. There are lots of support groups out there for those who are struggling, where you're able to realize that you're not alone in that. And just normalizing seeing a therapist. It can be a really good practice, especially as helpers. So much of what we give comes out of the cup that we have, right? We're giving of ourselves in this deep way. And so making sure that we are seeing someone to take care of our own mental health so that we're able and healthy to care for others. Practice self-compassion. So my last slide, we're going to talk about self-compassion, but self-compassion is so important. We're compassionate and caring, and we have grace for those around us. And often we're critical and hard on ourselves, and just taking the intentional space to be compassionate towards ourselves. What else? What else do you guys find helpful?
One of the things in chatting with a couple of friends, just to see if anybody had questions that they would like the opportunity to answer. And something that someone brought up today that they said found really helpful is a gratitude journal. Yeah. So, the journal specific to gratitude. So even on, I think it was -37 this morning with the wind when she was chatting to me. And so I said, just looking out the window, it wasn't very windy. There's still snow on everything. It looked beautiful. I didn't have to go outside. So the beauty of that, and that I didn't have to be outside in the cold, it's something that could be added to a gratitude journal. It's there. And often when we're in a pinch and we're struggling, we're not seeing it. So to be intentional in that, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great addition. Yeah. Glenda, anything else to add?
Just with the journaling, I'm with you. I don't like to journal. Writing a whole lot of stuff doesn't work. But what I did find, and somebody helped me with a lot of years ago, was drawing. Draw a picture. Draw and it doesn't have to be a good picture. But if you don't want to journal, can you draw what you're feeling? And I found that really helpful. And sometimes it's scribbles. Sometimes it's, really elaborate kinds of things. And that really helped to kind of get through those emotions. Or writing one word. Get the journal. Just if I can put down one word, I'm good.
Yeah. Just getting it out somewhere.
Yeah. Just put down one word, one thing that you can put down somewhere.
Yeah. No, I love that.
It was helpful for me.
Yeah.
Just further, Carlie, when you were saying about your coworkers and how helpful that was another bit in the conversation that I had with a friend about finding your people. So people where there is trust, and I know particularly now with all the division that we're experiencing as a society, not just in our community, but around the world, really, at this time, is being able to find those people that maybe you can't meet in person, but you have a deep and reciprocal relationship. So you can invest into their life, and they are also returning that investment into yours in some way. You can be there, you can be exactly who you are and where you are with them, to be able to have people like that, and try, if you don't have them, to try and find that, build your tribe, build your team, is a really great way to build support.
Yeah, and that mutual piece, we'll talk about a bit about that when we get to boundaries. That mutual piece is so important, right? Because we want someone that we can confide in, and then we want to reciprocate and do that for them as well, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, let's look at the social. So like the emotional, let's go hand in hand for that first piece. Let someone know you're struggling, right? Just letting someone know. Glenda, you talked about getting a word out. For me, I'm a pretty verbal processor. And so just saying it out loud is really meaningful for me. And so if I have my people and just be able to say, hey, I'm struggling, it can be really meaningful. And just seems like it takes the edge off, like acknowledging that it's there with someone that cares about me and not being alone in it can be so powerful. And sometimes just doing something for fun with someone. Sometimes we just need a break. Our world is exhausting and chaotic, and we're overwhelmed. And I remember, I think back to 4 years ago when, that my boss pulled me in and told me what had happened at work. There was a suicide of someone I'd worked with. And I was able to process a little bit with that, with a friend and colleague. But then I just said, like, can we just go do something that was fun? And we just went out into prairie land and drove around and, found somewhere to hang out and just kind of laugh and take a breath from the intensity and creating space for yourself and permission. Even in the midst of a difficult season, you can give yourself permission to just go do something fun and have a break from the intensity. So that for me has been really meaningful. Join a regular group activity. Maybe it's a reading group or a class at the gym. If it's a regular scheduled thing and someone's waiting for you to show up, I know I'm more likely to go, especially if I paid money. If it's like a gym class, it's less even about the working out and more about leaving the house and doing something with others. If I have paid, I'm going to show up. And if someone's expecting me, I'm probably going to show up. So find somewhere that's a regular scheduled activity, whatever that might be for you, where you're known, where people know your name maybe, and attend that regularly. Set healthy boundaries where they're needed. And again, we've got a few slides on that because that seems to be a request. And a big one recently is to be mindful of our social media engagement. If something is negative or irritating, taking a toll on you, it might be time to mute or unfollow accounts. I have said this more in the last month, 2 weeks, even few months than ever. I know for myself, spending time on social media lately has been exhausting and draining. And so I went through and muted a bunch of accounts that just were having an impact on me, where I felt kind of what I did was just, I felt invalidated. I felt overwhelmed. I've actually, as of a few days ago, taken a social media break. It's okay to just take a break for a few days. If your social media is having a negative impact on your mental health, maybe think through, are there some things you need to consider, like muting accounts or taking a break? Sandra, Glenda, anything to add to that? I know, Sandra, you and I talked a little bit about the social media thing. Anything to add there?
I find also just media in general. So being mindful of what I take in, whether it's, in print or on TV, any of that sort of stuff. Things are happening in the world, and it isn't that I'm trying to ostrich about anything that's happening in the world, but I don't necessarily need to hear the intensity of how, or the bias of how something might be reported. Because though each of those factors will absolutely play with my mental health. And I learned that a number of years ago, to just shut it off.
How about you, Glenda?
Totally agree with that, the social media thing. Finding that regular scheduled group, something, whatever that is is so important to keep the social, and whether that's just texting somebody or making a phone call. For myself, I find if I'm at home or busy or working, sometimes I just need to set aside and say, okay, I'm going to take 3 people off my contact list today and I'm going to phone them. And just see. And so you look at that contact list and how many people are on there. And it's like almost, yeah, I do. I really look forward to, okay, I'm going to phone them, or I'm going to connect with them in some way.
Being
That
intentional
makes that
in that,
sense.
intentional in maintaining and building connections. Very important.
For sure.
Yeah, perfect. And then lastly, we'll go with the spiritual. Again, it's not necessarily about being religious, but caring for that spiritual side of yourself. And so for me, prayer is really important. That's somewhere that I find really fills my tank, is just spending time in prayer. Singing songs that evoke a spiritual experience. So I didn't grow up in a religious family. So it makes me laugh, but my mom was a big U2 fan. Like, so for her, listening to Bono and listening to U2 songs, and she talked about going to concerts. She said that it was a spiritual experience. She said something in my spirit, and so I it was this kind of first, even in our home, even exposure to that kind of language. But finding those things that create a spiritual experience for you, and filling your tank with them. They're important pieces of who we are. So that might be like walking in nature, or yoga and meditation. Just might be time alone and quiet to reflect. Sandra, Glenda, do you have anything else, that you or friends use to fill your tank in the spiritual area?
Reading.
Yeah.
I'd have to say reading. I'm an avid reader. I love to read.
Yeah.
And so depending on sort of where I'm at is what kind of reading do you do? But definitely reading is huge.
Yeah. Yeah. Sandra, how about you?
Reading for sure, and I've got a pretty awesome playlist of songs, primarily Christian artists, and there's just, depending on where I am or what's going on in my life, there are specific artists or specific songs that I'm drawn to, and I find hugely helpful.
And setting up a playlist ahead of time is helpful, because again, in that place where we're struggling and we need something, putting something together in that moment is really difficult. So having, books available, or having a library card, or having that playlist ready helps us when we need it, right? And it's setting ourselves up that when we need something, we've got a strategy. So the big question I want to ask then is, how can we make self-control not feel like more work? Because the amount of times I've heard, our coworker, our employers, you need to practice self-care, and the bubble bath doesn't cut it for me. And, how do we see this as not just one more thing to do? And so ideally we pay attention and we catch it early, because when we're on the, more extreme side of compassion fatigue or burnout, it's hard to add something new. So ideally we're paying attention to all 4 areas, and we catch it early. And we might invite others to share their concerns. So if they're seeing something, we'll catch it early. It's easier to care for ourselves then. We also want to start small. To think, what could I do that will make myself feel fully better right now, might feel overwhelming. But I can start small, and I want to know what strategies will help in different situations. So if all I have is one tool, if all I have is a hammer and I need a saw, that thing's not going to work there, right? I need more than one strategy that I know work for me. And I need something that's small, and I only can do something small. So for example, if I'm really struggling, there's no way I'm going to the gym and working out, even though I know that's helpful. Like the idea of getting in my car, putting workout clothes on, driving in the cold to a gym, going in the gym, working, there's too many steps. If I'm struggling and my tank is low, it's not going to happen. But I know that if I'm at home, like I got a cat, she's pretty like soft. She's, if I go play with my cat, I will feel 10% better. It's not going to make me fully better, but it's going to take the edge off, and I'll feel a little bit better. I know if I do that, at the end of it, I'll feel well enough to maybe throw on some headphones and throw a podcast on or some music and go for a walk outside. And that's going to help with another 10%. And then I might not feel ready enough to call a friend and say, hey, I'm struggling. But I actually might feel well enough after those 2 things to call a friend and say, do you want to play some board games? And once I play board games for a little bit, I might be willing to open up. And so I just know that, I might not be able to get everything at once, but I know that I can start with something small and easy and not overwhelming. And that will help me feel well enough to do one more thing. And just starting getting the ball rolling for what's helpful. Finally, do what works. So what works for me and what works for you, Sandra and Glenda, will be different, as will for our friends and family. And so find the things that work for you and do them. I mean, how effective is that? Figure out what works for you and do more of it. So anything to add?
I think you covered it. Something that I do find is quite helpful that surprised me during initial lockdown and COVID. There wasn't really much anyone could do, and I just started doing a bit of painting just for fun. And that is something that just that idea of doing something creative, get in touch with that creative side that I just sort of had set aside for, many years, but to be able to do that and it's completely mindless. So the focus is off anything that might be presenting a challenge, and it's just about the fun of doing something creative. And for sure that I found that helpful. And another way too, which maybe sounds odd, but sometimes in the times of a struggle, I find if I can think of a way to bless someone else who's also struggling, I find that really honestly very helpful. And I know that kind of confuses people, but it works for me to be able to see that in the struggle that somebody else is as well, and I'd like them to know in some small way that they're not alone. And I find
generosity is one of the best things we actually can do that helps us feel good and strong, and all those things. Generosity is fantastic. Yeah. I used to keep a gym bag in the back of my car, and I knew that on a really bad day at work, if I was in a bad space, going home, I would just ruminate, right? So if I just had a really tough client and I wasn't quite ready, if I went home, it would just impact me. So the gym bag was just in my car, that if a day at work had been particularly intense, I would just make sure that I stopped at the gym on the way home. And even if it was just a quick 30-minute workout, having it there and ready meant if I went home, I was not likely to go back out. But having it there and ready and just setting myself up that, for success in that way is really helpful. So, have whatever that is that you need, having that available to you, so that you don't have to do all the work in the moment when you're not motivated to do that, I think might help us make it feel less like work when we're struggling.
If this session has left you needing further information or support, or if you'd like to receive the PDF of the resources shared in today's session, please reach out via email to shauna@eastsidechurch.ca. Shauna will assist you in getting connected and can forward you these resources. This earthly walk can be really challenging sometimes. None of us should ever walk alone or suffer in silence. Ram Dass says it so well. We're all just walking each other home. God bless.